right. Hello, everyone. We want to welcome everyone to our monthly virtual mental health ministry conversation. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, we ask that you go ahead and share the post. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, please go ahead and share the post. If you'd like to join us on the Zoom platform, pinned to the top of the comments, you'll see a Zoom link. You can click that link and join us. But I want you to share, and we're looking forward to a wonderful conversation. I present to you the coordinator of our mental health ministry, John Parker.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. I got these new headphones. Just want to make sure they work properly. And disclaimer, I'm on super dad duties today and by myself. So children seem to only need help when you can't help them. So hopefully everything will smoothly and everybody be okay. But if I'm a little distracted here and there, it's just because the kids need their father's attention. I'm trying to,
I got you.
double duties right
I got you. That's
now.
mental.
So
You got mental health. You got the mental health therapists are not exempt.
exactly. I'm
Yeah.
working. I'm working. All right, cool. Well, today, in light of sermon that Pastor Ross preached this Sunday, just a lot of things that are kind of going on, just in our world right now, in our state, in our city. I just wanted to have a conversation about grief. And I know throughout the last few months we've kind of dibbled and dabbled about, with different issues such as depression and different things like that. But grief has a special place in my heart, just because I didn't grow up learning how to manage grief well. It wasn't something that was taught in school. And I've had a lot of personal tragedies that I wasn't really taught how to just kind of deal with. And I've been in environments and in situations where grief has struck. And I've been instructed to, suck it up, keep your chin up, middle men don't cry, all the things that people say that don't often usually help in those situations. And I just wanted us to understand grief and how grief works, have a conversation about it, and just understand the process of grief. Just as a way to kind of help us be in better space when it comes to managing grief and understanding how it works. Okay. All right, we can go to the first slide, the next slide.
All right.
All right. So grief, as a definition, is the emotional response to a loss that encompasses feelings of sadness, anger, confusion, and more. So grief is maybe not often thought of as an emotion for some people, but as we think of it in the mental health field, it's an emotion. It's something that you feel, it's something that you experience, it's something that you go through, and it's not just oh, this thing happened and I move on to the next thing. Some people, like to move like that. It's not always a healthy way to do it, but it's definitely it's an emotion, and it's something that we have to experience. And there's a proper way in which we kind of manage grief that's helpful and healthy for us. And there are common causes of grief, usually coming from death of a loved one, divorce, loss of a job. It's usually something that is unexpected. Sometimes it can be expected, and depending on how the situation came about, usually dictates how we're able to manage it on the front end. If we know that something's going to happen down the road and we can prepare for it, usually we're generally more prepared for it when it happens. But when things happen suddenly, catches us by surprise, oftentimes those things are a little more difficult to handle, and can leave us in a down place for a much longer time.
Does, does grief
Mhm.
does grief
Mhm.
always is it always I was noticing the things, some of the examples. Is it always some type of separation involved in grief?
No, not always. Sometimes separation. It could. I mean, you could be in something, and experiencing something continually, or in the present tense, and feel grief. It's not necessarily like you say in the separation, somebody passing away, or some sudden thing that happens. It can be a continual state for some people. I know some people, that are in marriages and they're consistently feeling a sense of grief, or they're in work situations where they're feeling grief. But usually, when we look at grief, we kind of think of it as a lens of loss, um, or some traumatic event. And but it doesn't, like you said, it doesn't have to be some like quick separation, some real traumatic event. If that
Okay.
answers your question.
Yes, sir.
All right. And the lens we'll be kind of looking through. So there's a lot of different ways that people look through the lens of grief and try to understand grief. And so for the purpose of our conversation, I'll be looking at the 5 stages of grief, which is the Kubler-Ross model. Was developed in 1969 as a way in which to help people understand the grieving process. And I know sometimes, you have to be hesitant on how you accept certain people's ways in which they do things. Some people like to put raisins in their potato salad. Some people don't. Some people like to, wash their chicken before they cook it. Some people don't. So sometimes when you're thinking about ways in which you manage mental health things, it's important to understand the background of the people and where the information comes from. And so in this situation, I tried to use a generally found model of understanding grief that doesn't really it's not really ruled by like gender or race or anything like that. It's kind of just a very general way in which people process grief, and a way in which we can kind of have this conversation that is safe for the spaces that we're in. If you guys pick up what I'm putting down, and so for this, the 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And not everyone experiences these stages in this exact order, but these are just the 5 ways in which, for this particular model, we're using people understand grief. So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Any questions?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So denial with the first stage, again, it's not in any particular order, but we just go denial first. It's a defense mechanism that buffers the immediate shock of the loss. And so defense mechanism is basically a fancy way of saying it's the way in which our bodies process what has happened. It's a defense mechanism. Some people's defense mechanism is to put up a wall when they get angry. Some people's defense mechanism is to like move away or to leave situations when they're afraid. And so for loss, when we're talking about grief, a defense mechanism that buffers the immediate shock of the loss is denial. And so the symptoms of denial are a refusal to accept the reality of the loss, feeling numb or disbelief. And so there is and I'm looking at the people on the call now, so no one here may be familiar with this, but there is a thing that kind of happens now with a lot of these young like rappers who pass away from like usually from gun violence. There's one particular guy, I think he's out of Jacksonville, who recently was reported murdered on his birthday, as a matter of fact. And people keep Okay, thank you guys. Thank you. I'm on my conversation. Tell them to stop, please. So there's been the denial that he has passed away keeps popping up in different people's social media posts where they're saying that they've seen him and they spotted him and they say, oh, you say I think the guy's name is Julio. You say Julio's dead, but I seen him here. I seen him there. And so for some reason, there's a lot of this that's happening in just kind of with young people and maybe in the way they're processing loss, but it's the denial that that person is actually dead. So they won't show the funerals. They won't make public knowledge of where the festivities or whatever activities that are taking place around that, for the sake of keeping the allure alive that the person hasn't passed away. And I mean, so many things are public record. You can find out the person passed away, but for some reason, these young folks are just kind of in this space where denial is their go-to defense mechanism to help them process that loss. And the example is, people will say, this can't be happening, or this, I can't believe it's happening, or it didn't happen, in the case of the illustration that I was given. Any questions there? Out. All right. So anger is the next phase. Again, not in any particular order. It's as it sounds. So feelings of frustration and helplessness may turn into anger. So when you're experiencing grief, when there's a loss or something that has happened, frustration and helplessness, which is a normal feeling to have, especially when it's something has happened that's beyond your control. That leads to frustration for sure, and it definitely leads to helplessness if you feel like, man, this thing's happened and there's nothing I can do about it, and that can turn into anger. And so when left unchecked, and when we don't process properly our grief, that anger can turn into lashing out at others, blaming or resentment. I've had to deal, not deal, I should say, I've had to help couples who've lost a child. And a lot of times those relationships, if, especially if that's the only child, end in divorce or some type of long-term separation or just long-term lingering, ongoing bitterness, especially if one spouse feels as if it was the other person's fault. And so you have to do a lot of work to kind of help couples work through that. But again, it's the idea that when you're properly, or I should say, when you're able to manage grief and process grief and deal with grief in the healthiest ways possible. This may happen, anger may happen, lashing out may happen, blaming may happen, resentment may happen, but it doesn't have to be something that leads to eventual breakups or divorces or whatever. But can things happen. But at the end of the day, that's kind of the goal of our conversation, kind of understanding how we can manage things in a way that when stuff like this happens, when tragedies happen, we don't have to strike out at our partner, lash out at our partner, or whoever, friends or family that are around us, and blame them or have resentment when it comes to the loss. And then again, an example of how this manifests in people's attitudes or behaviors, you might say, "Why did this happen? It's not fair." Any questions?
So what about, and so I've heard people say, and I'm not even sure, I'm not even looking at it from a negative point. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but like, people kind of blame God. And so, but not to the point of God, you did this bad, but that God allowed it. And I think most of our faith says that God does allow things to happen, but is kind of putting it on God. Is that a piece of where we say, you know why did this happen, or we're blame, or this, when I say the symptom that we're blaming others, does it have to be uh an anger thing, or could it also be just you got to point the finger at somebody, or some reason why it happened? I mean, am I connecting those two, or it doesn't really apply as it relates to?
Yeah, no, yep, 100%. I think oftentimes, especially as humans, in my experience, people don't deal with gray areas well, right? When we don't have answers to something, like you said, somebody's got to be to blame. We've got to be able to point the finger. And oftentimes, especially people of faith, or even sometimes people without faith, which is very odd, like to blame God. Um, because, like you said, we live in a fallen world, we live in a broken world. Things happen, tragic happens, then bad things happen to good people. And in that sense, since we aren't able to ourselves prevent those things from happening, in certain things happen, we are left to wonder, we are left to question, we are left to blame God because He does allow, air quotes, He does allow things to happen. He doesn't always intervene. He doesn't always save. He doesn't always stop the loved one from passing away. He doesn't always stop the hurricane from sweeping away people. And so I think that that is part of the grief process is looking for answers and sometimes placing blame in places or towards deities, God in this example, um, when we're looking for answers. And I think it's a natural thing. It's what people do, especially when we're finite creatures and we're trying to understand answers, especially when it's like, why do bad things happen to good people? I feel like that's always a case in which it throws people off and people really struggle to understand why this thing has happened. And it's not fair really comes into the light because there's so many bad people that you see every day and they're doing just fine and nothing's going on and nothing's happening to them and they seem to be living their best life. But then when a good person is lost or someone who's seemingly doing good things, it doesn't feel good. So I think that blaming and that resentment definitely is a big thing in that situation, and it definitely very often gets the finger gets pointed towards God.
So do you feel that it's healthy, or it's not really connect? Do you feel like, so even if I say God allowed, and so I don't come off as mad at
Mhm.
God, but I still kind of say God had something to do with He allowed. Do you feel that it's healthy to kind of find somebody to put the blame on, or it is what it is? 'Cause I guess the opposite of that is just it's life, and
Mhm.
so I don't necessarily need to say that God went ahead and gave the okay, but I guess if it makes me feel
Mhm.
better. Do you feel like it's healthy to kind of just
Mm.
put it on God for when just normal life events happen?
I think it's a first step. I won't say it's healthy long term. I think it's a first step that, again, when people are trying to understand what's happening, especially when people are religious, or again, I can't say that when people, even when people aren't religious, they like to blame God. But I think it's a, if your perspective is God has allowed this thing to happen, then there also has to be, okay, but then what? But now what? Right. And so that follow up is, He has allowed this to happen. What does that mean for me? What does God say about the people that are left behind when tragedy strikes and then a loved one passed away and you're still here? What is the totality of that whole uh, line of thinking? Because it just can't begin and end with God allowed, and now I'm angry with God, and I'll no longer keep my faith, or I'll be, there's a process, and I think it's an okay place to have those questions and to have those thoughts, and to want to understand this idea of what does it mean that God allows, but that's not the whole picture. We can't just stop there. So it's not healthy to stop there. I think it can be healthy to begin there, to allow thoughts to process, to allow you to process, to allow you to think through things, to allow you to question your own mortality, all those things that are there. But if it ends there, then that's an unhealthy place. Like, you have to keep going and you have to think past that. Just like you're saying on the other end, that's life. That can be a beginning place to think about tragedy or loss or grief or how you manage grief, but that can't be the totality of the thought. It's like, okay, that's life. Okay, but then what else is there in life? Is there more to life? What are other things that are going on? What does this loss mean to me? How do I process it properly? How do I allow this loss or this grief that I'm dealing with to shape me into a better person or to push me in the right direction? And so I think that, in answering your question, it's both of those ways of thinking are starting points. But if they're your end point and that's the only place you go, then that's definitely unhealthy, and you're not going to be able to properly grieve and move in a direction of health. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, yeah. Because I just asked the question because I think for the most part, and we have, I think probably most on here, or or not all, if not all, are believers in Christ, and I feel that when we kind of put it on God, He allowed it. I think that gives us a sense of calm, but I just wonder, is it healthy that somebody has to be blamed? And when I'm not saying that we blame God in a negative way, but we give Him the credit for it. He gave the thumbs up. Just wondering if there has to be someone to blame in the end. So I think you said it's a part of the process, but that's not the end point that we want to be at. From what I'm
Yeah.
understanding.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, and I think that again, the someone to blame is the human nature of us, and then understanding, okay, well, who do we blame, or how do we blame, or what does that look like? And so again, yeah, that is the beginning point to moving towards healing. Um, and it's a tough thing because, especially when you have situations where a certain situation doesn't always end the same. Say, for instance, like my grandmother had, I think she had dementia, and she didn't necessarily pass away from dementia, but it's one of those things where her memory, was getting worse and worse and worse. For some people, dementia is indifferent than other people. Some people, dementia stops at a certain place. And so it's like we don't we don't we don't know. We don't have answers. We can't be definitive in, like, God allow, God, God stopped it from going so far. When healings happen, we say thank you, God, right? When good things happen, we like, man, bless the Lord, thank you that happened. But when it doesn't end the way in which we want it to end, how we manage that next feeling that we have or those next thoughts that we have, I think is the bigger point that doesn't get spoken to enough. Because it's like it's easy to thank God for the good things, and it's easy to be thankful when things work out the way we want them to. But when things end up in loss, um, what do we do? And I think that's kind of the point of the rest of our conversation. But I think what you're saying is important because oftentimes we don't move past that anger and that frustration and that blame. And then that's when we get stuck in a place for a very long time or sometimes forever, because we don't have a way in which to make sense of what happened. And like you're saying on the onset, yes, people try to make sense of it by saying God allowed, or, it was in God's hands, and, he said no, or he said yes, or whatever the case may be. Um, But I think the real issue for me, and again, this is for me speaking for me, is that we don't have the answer, unless the Lord definitively speaks us by and says, I allowed this to happen because XYZ. Um, but when we don't have definitive answers of why something happens, I think it doesn't do us justice to try to figure out why. It doesn't do us justice to blame and sit and just keep the blame there. It doesn't do us justice to necessarily look for someone to blame when we don't have an answer to why the thing happened. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck. I hope I'm not going in circles. I'm trying to
No,
drive the point home is that
no, you gotta help me. I mean, because I still, I, sometimes I just wonder, with and I'm a pastor and I should know, um,
Mhm,
but still, just at times I sit and think about my sister, and
mhm.
go ahead.
So, so John, this is Irma. Um,
Yes.
I found that a lot of times grief will take different forms for me. For me, um, I could be, let's say, just for sake of argument, making a cake, and then all of a sudden, I will have that memory of this is a cake mom used to like, and I would be happy making the cake because it was something she used to like. But then again, there were times when I'd have a memory of her if I was doing something and it would just totally knock me out. So I just found it as grief takes different form for me it takes different forms, and it surprised me a lot that I would have these different reactions. I knew what they were, but because they were like at the opposite ends of the spectrum, it really just knocked me out to know that it was such a powerful, that grief is such a powerful thing. It really knocked me out to realize that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it's one of those things where you never know when it's going to strike. You never know when those feelings are going to pop up. You never know when those, like you're saying, I'm baking a cake. And next thing you know, oh my goodness, you get flooded with these emotions and with these thoughts. And so I think it's one of those things where it's it's undescribable. Like I said, some things I just don't have answers to. I think sometimes we just don't have answers to. And I think that's why I was saying where if we start with trying to understand and then we progress and we go through stages of things that kind of help us understand or just become uh I don't even want to say just okay with because that kind of who wants to just be okay with something. But we have to figure out what is the end thought. Like this thing happened, I miss this person, or this wasn't fair, I don't like that this happened, this was not okay. um what do we make of that, and how does it either propel us forward? How does it increase our faith? How does this help us understand God and who God is? How does this help us understand the world? How does this give us a charge or give us a new mission, or put a battery in our pack, like we say? And it's no, it's not a it's it's not fun to be like, let me find the silver lining in this cloud, or let me see the light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to grief, when it comes to tragedy. But I think that's one of the things that, at least as believers, we can have a space where we're like, hey, we know that we have a God that can help us through. It may not, you know, our faith in what we have going on may not necessarily keep me from crying when I think about my sister or my mama or the times that I had or the things that happened. But again, that's why I'm saying when we look at the end point, it's like there is an end that exists that we can look towards and know that we'll be at a space, in a time, in a place where we can grieve well, where we can think of the good times, where we can have those happy memories be the things that flood us. um, and we just have to. I hate to use the cliche of trust the process, but we have to go through the process so that we get to that end point and can be healthy. But I can't promise or say that those moments in between will feel good, will be comfortable, will be helpful. Like it's just an uncomfortable space. Grief is just not a it's just not a comfortable thing. And it's unfortunate, especially when tragedies happen when we don't have definitive answers of why this thing happened. And it's unfortunate we have to not unfortunate, but it's just like we have to now trust in something outside of our own understanding to make sense of the situation. Any questions there? Okay. Um, and bargaining is another step. And bargaining is one of those things where the grieving person is trying to negotiate with the higher power or make promises to reverse the loss, right? And so um, I feel like there's a lot of times, me personally, I've been in spaces where um, and it wasn't right of me, but when someone close to me was passing away, uh I was thinking about all the other people that I was like, Lord, take that person, take this person, there's this person, like why this person? Or I would try to make my own negotiation. Lord, I'll do this, Lord, I'll do that. If you deliver, I'll read my Bible more, I'll be a better person, I'll be a better person, I'll be a better father. There's all these negotiations that happen. Again, this is part of the process, this is normal, this is what we do, um to try to come up with some way in which to keep the inevitable from happening if it's something that we can see that's happening, or for just bargaining so that we can maybe prevent the thing from happening, even if it's something that's not on the horizon. I mean, we pray all the time, right? We pray for safety, we pray for God to watch over us, we pray for all these different things, and that's not necessarily bargaining in the sense of grief, but it's just something that we do. And so when I'm saying it's a part of the process, when when grief is happening, part of the process is bargaining, because that's what we innately do, to try to mediate that loss or kind of deal with that situation, especially when it comes to negotiating with a higher power. Um, in our case with God, trying to help, hey Lord, please this, please that, I'll do this, I'll do that. Can you do this? Can you do that? And then some of the symptoms of when you're stuck in this bargaining space is that you dwell on what you could have done differently or what could have been done differently. And again, this is specific to bargaining, specifically to grief, and specifically to being stuck in this particular space to where, man, if I'd have done this, or if this would have happened, or if we'd have moved here, or we'd have moved there, if we'd have never did this, or we'd have never did that, this thing wouldn't have happened. And it may not be true. And sometimes it may be true. But if we're stuck in that place, um, like I said, we're not going to be able to move into a space of health, and we're not going to be able to go through the process of grieving well. Any questions there? And depression, I think, is a little more obvious for people when we're talking about dealing with the grieving process. And it's this is not necessarily the same as like a clinical diagnosis of depression, but it's just a deep sadness as the reality of the loss that's in. And so again, it may happen in the front end, it may happen towards the middle, happen towards the end of the process of grieving. But it's a place where it's like, man, this is really about to happen, or man, that really did happen after the event has taken place. And again, it doesn't always have to be loss of a loved one. It could be a lost a job, or some other event has taken place. But it's the idea that, man, intrinsically you've come to the place where you realize and understand that this has really happened, and the reality sets in. And when that happens, when you're in that stage, feelings of emptiness, withdrawing from people, no longer engaging in things that used to be interest to you, not hanging out with your friends, not watching the football game. There's things that happen that display that we're in that place. And again, there's an initial time where that happens, and you're like, hey, you know what? I just need some time. I'm gonna take some time. I'm gonna be to myself, whatever. But if you're there for extended amounts of time, that is a telltale sign that that depression thing is a stage when it comes to grief that you're stuck in. And the example here is when the thought process is, I miss them so much, life will never be the same. Um, thank you. Thank you. Go ahead and open the door. Thank you. Like I miss him so much, life will never be the same. And so it's one thing to have that thought, and to maybe think about that. But just the idea of dwelling on that and being in that space again for an extended period of time is going to leave us stuck in that space and not allow us to go through the stages of grief in a way that we can move towards health. And like I said, for some people, they go through life, the rest of their life feeling that way. And I know a lot of people who lose spouses, and they don't remarry because they're like, hey, that was the love of my life. I'll never feel that way again. And they're one and done in the sense of that nature. And sometimes it's healthy, sometimes it's not. But I think that, if again that thought of I miss him so much, life will never be the same, becomes your forever feeling, and there's no health that ever happens after that. There's no growth that happens after that. There's movement. There's no movement towards healing that happens after that. Then you're stuck in that space, and it's not good for you long term.
And
Any
I
questions?
know you probably don't have like the answer for this right here, but I'm just thinking out loud. I just wonder um, if will has a lot to do with I because you talked about spouses. I've seen people to where and more than one case. I've seen several situations where somebody was married for a pretty long time and the spouse dies. I've seen the other spouse not even necessarily get sick, but after a relatively short period of time, when months or so afterwards, the other spouse is just gone. And so I wonder if that the pressure could really take away the live, the will,
Doreen, how you doing?
could really take away the will to live, and if that will, um, if that does have the power to kind of just cause us just kind of to release it, because I've seen it just happen so many times with married couples, and the person didn't necessarily get sick; they just kind of died.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of phenomenons that science looks at when it comes to that. I don't think there's any like biblical reference, but there's a the will to live is a thing, and oftentimes, like you mentioned, especially with couples or close loved ones, um, that heartbreak, especially when you stick to the couples, that heartbreak that happens, they say that the person died from heartbreak, and it's one of those things where there isn't a test you take. There isn't blood that can be drawn. There's nothing that you, like you're saying, there's nothing that happens that measures what that looks like as far as dying from heartbreak, like what that looks like in terms of like, oh, we after the person dies and we measured their heart or we looked at this and we looked at that and we can tell that they died from heartbreak. It is a thing that happens. I don't have the explanation, like you said, of the technical reason why that happens. Um, but I think it's along the lines of failure to thrive. If you all are familiar with that, so basically when there was a test that was done, and I mentioned it before a long time ago in a European country. There was an experiment done on babies, which hasn't been done again. It kind of became illegal, where they took these kids that were orphans, and half of them they nurtured and and manufactured breastfeeding and touched them and all these different things, and those babies thrive. Those same orphan kids, the other half of those orphan kids, they didn't touch them. They just put them in their beds, fed them, without making real contact with them, and those babies died. And so this idea of failure to thrive happens when you're not being loved, when you're not being nurtured. Something just happens to your body, and you just fail. You don't have that. You fail to thrive any longer. And so the same thing, like you're saying, happens when we have the death of a loved one, especially with spouses, and something just happens inside of us. And I don't know if it can be helped if the person grieves properly. I don't have enough sample size to say one way or another, but I know that it for sure is a thing and it's a real thing. And I think if a person's not um, in a space to where they are managing grief well, I won't say properly, I'll just say well, that they're probably more susceptible uh, to passing away from the broken heart. Again, we don't have an official term for it, but dying from a broken heart. And I think it's just a part of it. Like you're saying, I think it's a part of for sure this depression piece when it comes to grief. And if people aren't careful to manage their grief well, Yeah, that loss can take you out,
So I think probably
and
as a
it has,
ministry,
and it does.
and so I think probably as a ministry, and I think we do a pretty good job at it. I see people like really stepping up, but I think one thing that we could do is just kind of help a person redefine themselves or find purpose. You know, and so it's not an idea of moving on, but just kind of helping them, you know, still see purpose, for themselves and for their lives. And even if they have to redefine themselves, I think that's probably a way that we can kind of help out in those situations.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that's definitely a ministry opportunity, and I think that definitely should happen more often because it's almost like empty nesters. There's all these phases of life, these stages of life, and things that happen, and if we don't have intentional, not want to say protocols, but like you said, ministry opportunities or things in place to help people deal with those stages, it can be very difficult for people to manage those things. I think you're absolutely right. There definitely has to be an intentional effort to help people reimagine their life, to find new purpose, to become active in some community and have some type of community, and not just waste away. And that is very, very, very important. Any other questions, comments, concerns? So acceptance is generally seen as the final stage. Like I said before, none of these things are necessarily they don't always happen in a linear fashion in the way that I presented it. But acceptance is kind of thought as the final stage where the person begins to come to terms with the loss. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're managing all the other aspects well. Hopefully, it is a place when acceptance finally hits that you know we're going through the process or we've gone through the process of grief and manage those other areas well. Because it's there are times where I feel like some people feel as if they're okay, they've come to terms with it. It is what it is, and then sometime later they just break down because it seemed like they were there and it seemed like they were comfortable with things and they came to terms with it, but something, either a trigger thing happens or they had a memory, like Sermon was saying, you're in the kitchen, something happens and they just break down. But breakdowns aren't the end. It just can be a bigger sign of that, hey, maybe there's some more grieving that needs to be done or some more healing that needs to take place. And again, it's also natural. Like, it's not, if you've grieved and you feel like you've come to terms with it and you still find yourself getting choked up at times or being sad at times or whatever, that's a normal part of the process. Uh, but if it keeps happening repetitively and it never seems to subside, or there's never a space that you feel like you can kind of finally manage life, and can process through those things when they just come out of nowhere in a healthy way, there may be a sign that you haven't um, gone through these stages of grief in a way that has allowed you to come to peace with things. And then again, the symptoms, for lack of a better word, or finding peace, understanding the reality of the situation, and moving forward. And even if we look at it, taking it away from the death thing, but just like jobs, sometimes you have people that work for these companies, and maybe they work for the company 30 years, and then all of a sudden they fire them or they let them go. And they're just like, I'm trying to understand, like, I've given my all to this job. I didn't go on vacations. I didn't see my kids' baseball games. I didn't do this. I didn't do that. And they just at a loss about the situation. And so even in those situations, there still has to be a peace that's found. Understanding the reality of the situation is, hey, business is business sometimes, especially in a corporate situation. Hey, they move on, they give you your severance package or not, and they find somebody to fill your spot, or they've already found somebody to fill your spot, or what is it? Sometimes you'll be the one that kind of trains your replacement, not knowing that you're the one training your replacement. But you have to move forward in those situations in order for this acceptance stage to be kind of closed and complete. An example of the way in which someone thinks when they're in that place is that I can't change what happened, but I can continue living. And I think that statement there kind of conceptualizes um, the totality of kind of what we're trying to get towards when we're talking about the stages of grief. I can't change what happens, but I can continue living. It may hurt, but I can continue living. I don't like it, but I can continue living. It wasn't fair, but I can continue living. Um, and that kind of like is a space in which where we can kind of point to for ourselves within ourselves that kind of points like, okay, I think I'm good. Again, I'm not necessarily happy. I'm not necessarily thrilled that this thing happened. I'm going to feel the wound for a long time. There's going to be a hole in my life. This person, or this thing that was no longer is, but I can continue living. And when we find ourselves in that space, it's a good sign that we've kind of gone through the grieving process according to this, in a way that's healthy. We're managing things well, and we're kind of moving forward in a healthy space.
So there's a message in the chat. But I'm not. If I read it wrong, you can come on and 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 read it the right way for me. But in just reading it, it says, "So what do you think is the difference when you lose a loved one in being alone and being lonely?"
Mm, mm. That's a good question. I think I understand. Basically saying that there's kind of a difference between being alone because of the loss and just being lonely in general. If I'm understanding it, Miss Jones, you can feel free to come in and correct me if I don't make sense of what I'm about to say. But I think that sometimes they are one and the same. You are lonely because of that loss, and there's a hole and something's missing. But I think that you can be lonely. What is it the sayings? You can be alone. What is it, alone in a crowded room? Is am I saying that? Are y'all familiar with that saying? And basically the idea is that you may be in a room full of people at a party, having people are having a good time, but you can still feel lonely. You can still feel isolated. You can still feel as if no one cares for you, no one loves you, no one's concerned about you. Uh, but being alone when you've lost someone is a literal more of a literal feeling because you're no longer with that person. And so you are maybe not necessarily alone because there's other people left in your life, there's other people left in the world, you may have other family members, but you don't have that person, especially if it was a spouse or a twin sister or a sister brother. There's different type of relationships, but I think that those are two different feelings that happen for different reasons, but they still give you an empty feeling. So one again is the loss from being alone because you don't have that person no more, especially again if it was a spouse. But then there's also the state of being lonely because it may be some other things that are happening in your life to where even when you're around other people, um, you feel like you're alone. Does that make sense, Joan? If you wanted to say something, or Pastor Ross, if that makes sense, and those two kind of differences there.
She said yes.
Okay. And I think in if in trying to make sense of that type of situation, you're welcome. That we do have to spend time. A lot of this stuff, a lot of times we don't spend enough time. Well, and we may spend too much time, but properly processing um, why we feel that way. So if someone was to come to me and say we were doing individual counseling, they were like, "Man, I feel alone after the loss of my loved one," then we would process and have conversation and think through like, well, what does this loss mean? Do you ever feel like that particular void can be filled? You just go along the line of questions that help the other person understand that loss, what it means, how to process it properly, and then again try to get to this place of, but can you continue living? How do you continue living? But when you're lonely, because you have other things going on, then that's another set of processing, another set of conversation that has to take place to help you understand and process why you're lonely. When like there was for example, there was this random story I heard the other day where there was this uh, a rapper. Again, I don't know why I get all these rapper analogies, but there's this famous, got all this money, got all this money, got all this money, and he had a barber that he was paying to come to his home to cut his hair. And one day the guy was like, "Hey, my millionaire, got all this money, all this fame, all this success, all this fortune." He's like, "Hey, what do you got going on today?" And the barber's like, "Well, I got more heads to cut." He's like, "Well, what if I paid you for all the different people that you had to cut today to come out, hang out with me, and play video games with me for the rest of the day?" And so he's like, that's how we became friends because he was lonely, had everything going for him, all these people around him, but he didn't have real connection with people. So he paid me, his barber, to not cut anybody else's hair that day and whatever day I would come over to be his friend. And in a sense, he paid for friendship, but eventually they became real friends or whatever. But that's how that being lonely kind of works. You may have everything going for you, everything seemingly like you got the world in your hand, but intrinsically you're empty on the inside because either you got people around you that are just there for the ride, or you're just not fulfilled, even with having all the money and the fame and all the things that come with that. Hopefully, I didn't belabor that point. And kind of like recap what I've already said, do people experience all the stages? Not always. Again, it doesn't always happen in the same order from like I presented it. And it may skip stages, it may go here, it may go there, things may come up later on down the line. But at the end of the day, you don't always have to expect to have to go through every single one of these uh, uh, feelings or emotions or processes or to actually or go through all these stages in order to properly manage your grief or deal with your grief. These again, this is just a model, this 5-step model in which these people came up with to help us understand grief and how to move into the to a safe place and a healthy place. And again, there's it's personal and there's no right way to grieve, but there's definitely a wrong way to grieve. But there's no there's no way of saying you have to do this and you have to follow these steps and these are the rules in order to feel better when you've experienced grief.
So when you say there's definitely a wrong way to grieve, um,
Mhm.
do you kind of mean like picking up some coping habits or coping mechanisms that could kind of be detrimental for other reasons?
100%. Yep, yep, definitely. That's a good one to go to. If you find yourself, overindulging in drugs and alcohol, if you find yourself overeating, if you find yourself committing acts of self harm, definitely, that's not those aren't coping skills or coping mechanisms that you want to have. And then also when the way you're processing it or dealing with it leads you to, extended periods of depression, not taking care of your hygiene, not taking care of your responsibilities, not going to work. There's outward things that happen when we're in that grieving process that aren't healthy, that aren't the right way to grieve. That may be a result of the grief process, but it's usually stuff that we do ourselves that's unhealthy that causes our life to kind of spiral in a direction that's not good.
So how would you advise a person that's not necessarily a professional, but they may see it in a loved one or somebody that they know? They may see some of these things that you're talking about, especially like the unhealthy coping mechanisms that might be developed. How could an unskilled person um, kind of communicate that they think that that person, may need to? Because I imagine also if you're at that place, you might become kind of irritable also, and you could actually somebody might actually push you away if
Yeah.
if they feel that you kind of overstepping your boundary. How does an unskilled person help a person that might be in this place?
Yeah. Well, it's 2 slides down. We can jump to that now.
Oh, okay.
Come back to these other ones, or I can keep whichever you want to
No,
do. We
we
can go to
get there
that
when
now.
you
Like,
we get there when you get there.
okay. No problem. I just want to keep strike while the iron's hot, but it won't take us long. We'll be right there. Okay, so let's go to the traditional stages. So these are the additional types of grief. Just real quickly, anticipatory grief when grief comes up and you're feeling a certain way before the actual loss happens. That happens all the time. Complicated grief that lasts longer and is more intense than typical. Some losses hit harder. Some job losses hit harder. Some national tragedies hits harder than others, and so grief isn't always 3-step model, 5-step model. There's things that complicate it. And disenfranchised grief is one that's particularly something that I think people in the African American community, Black community, kind of deal with almost on a daily basis. So disenfranchised grief is grief that is not recognized or validated by society. So you have something like a George Floyd that happens, and you have something like slavery that happens. You have something like Tyreek Hill getting arrested, or detained by the police. And you have these things and these visual things that happen that makes us resonate and feel a certain way, and you have people that'll tell you, well, that's not real, get over it, that's blah blah blah, and unfortunately, sometimes we have the patience to kind of tell those people, hey, mind your business. Some people, times we don't. Sometimes it makes us feel worse. But collectively, I think as a people, we experience a lot of disenfranchised grief because the majority population tries to invalidate our feelings about certain things. Or we might have a mayor or governor that tells us that it was beneficial for us to, have been slaves or whatever the case may be, and we learn skills from that. So when we're dealing with grief, uh, understanding that when we're being disenfranchised, not necessarily we shouldn't get over it sooner, or we shouldn't feel like, oh yeah, you're right, I'm tripping. Like, no, we deal with it, but just understanding that there's going to be some people that don't understand what we're going through. All right.
Yeah,
Um,
I think also, I mean, even like what we're doing now, having somebody from a professional point, because I don't think you can always just preach everything away, and
Mhm.
so might be to preach you into some emotions, but you still are not equipped with the skills, and so I think having these kind of conversations right here, they kind of equip with skills, and so the preaching is important and it's necessary, and it reveals, it uncovers, it pulls back layers, and shows us things. But I think you also gotta, add in people that have the gift to to help you understand some more technical reasons, some things that you may be going through that can also really be ministry. You can minister to a person's spirit um, by just like you're saying, anticipatory, complicated, disenfranchised, and the other types of grief we're talking about. I think these kind of discussions are good too. So I think you can still be spiritual, but understand everything's not going, all deliverance is not going to come through a sermon.
Mhm. Yep, I agree, and I think that takes wisdom to understand that, because I feel like that's what happens a lot of times. There was a separation between church and state when it comes to psychology, and a lot of in previous times, people, the mentality was pray it away, and you can pray things, and God can heal and He can move, but there's other ways in which God has inspired humans and given us wisdom on how to handle situations. Like you're saying, we can preach till we're blue in the face, but it has to hit the person in a certain way, and God has to hit them in a certain way, and maybe scriptures hitting a certain way, or maybe help from other people hitting a certain way, or maybe just somebody sitting like Job's friend should have did would have hit in a certain way, instead of like you saying trying to preach a sermon or talk somebody through it and to blue in the face. There's ways in which that we can come alongside somebody and help them through these processes. 100%. All right. So coping with grief, we do this one quickly. This is individual. The next slide we'll talk about what we can do for others. But when you're talking about yourself and strategies for healing, um, the one thing that is the worst thing that we could do is not feel the emotions that we're feeling, because when we stop up that tub, eventually it's going to overflow, right? And so you got to pull the stopper out. You got to let the water run out. You got to feel those emotions. There may be a time and place that you set aside for it to happen. But when we bottle up those emotions and we don't feel the feelings that we feel, it doesn't help us. And I think that goes back to the question we talked about earlier, like trying to point the finger at someone to blame. Part of the process is feeling those emotions so we can uh, properly express how we're feeling about those things, or we're trying to look for somebody to blame. And if we don't go through those feelings and understand what it is that we're feeling, why do we feel this loss, why does this hurt so deeply, what does this mean to me, it doesn't help us grieve in a proper way or in a healthy way. Seek support from friends and family or a counselor, a pastor. Find healthy outlets such as journaling or exercising, and you create a routine to bring stability during times of loss. And so when I help people with loss, I'm like, hey, you got to have a routine. You got to be doing something consistently. You got to do something, because those feelings are going to come in waves. Those thoughts are going to come in waves. And if you don't have something set in stone that you can do to kind of help you manage that, or something that you're doing on a daily basis to kind of keep you going in the background and keep you from being narrowly focused on that loss, it's gonna make the process harder. So we got to do these things in order to help us cope better with it. Uh, Okay, and then supporting others through grief. So this is what we're talking about. So when we're trying to help someone, you don't have to have a degree, you don't have to be a paid professional. Um, One of the best things that we can do is listen without judgment. So just let them talk about their feelings. Just let them say what needs to be said. Let them have the conversation. Now you don't want to let people just be like negative, 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 and you know, just kind of be in a space of like, I don't know, just it's good to let people talk. It's good to let people vent, but there's certain times where it's like, all right, you got to kind of redirect the energy if it's too negative for too long. It's just not healthy to be in that space. So it's not necessarily for you to step in and like, oh, I'm tired of hearing you talk about this problem, but it's more so just like, hey, how do you gently help them redirect or better process? But hopefully you'll be able to just listen and just let them talk and just let them get it off their chest. And then being patient, because everyone grieves at their own pace. So the worst thing you can, not the worst thing, but a thing that you don't want to do is try to push and 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 uh, try to get someone to move faster than they're able to make to move when it comes to grief. Because again, everybody moves at their own pace. But again, there is a limit, there is a level where like, hey, I think it's hey, you're starting to decline, your health's starting to decline, you're not doing the things you need to do, you're not taking care of yourself, you're not bathing, you're not taking care of your kids. Like there is a point to which becomes a thing, and we're like, hey, we need to maybe get some help. But be patient with the person and don't push them too hard. And then, like I said, offer help, but don't push. So simple gestures can make a difference, but respect their pace. So respect their space. So sometimes, again, just sitting with the person, bringing a meal. I know a lot of times people do meal trains for people. They'll have different people come and prepare meals and bring food to the person. Um, just being a shoulder to cry on. Just doing things to be in that person's space and in their life, but not take up their space and not make them just be uncomfortable. Like just offer the help, but don't be pushy. And one of the things that I struggle with to this day is finding the right things to say
Right.
in moments of grief, right? And I'm people get mad at me like, why aren't you saying it? Like, bro, you do this for a living. Like, I understand, but you say the wrong thing, and that'd be the only thing that person ever remembers about you ever for the rest of their life. Like, this was supposed to be my friend, and he said the dumbest thing I could have possibly heard somebody say in a moment when I was grieving, and I would hate to be that person. But people do it all the time. They just say the craziest things, the worst things that you could possibly say. And two of them here, it's for the best, or they're in a better place. Those things can be hurtful. Like you may have good intentions, and you may be trying to say things that are comforting, but sometimes it's better just to be quiet. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? And just be there with that person. Put your arm around their shoulder, let them cry on you, pass them a
you're right.
tissue,
Mhm.
because it can just go wrong. It can go bad. So
Yeah,
thoughts, questions,
Yeah.
concerns?
Yeah. In ministry, we call that the ministry of silence.
yeah.
And
Mhm.
so you don't always. Some people feel the pressure to have to say something, and I really see. And when I see that, I just kind of pray that I just kind of just hope that person kind of get it that you don't have to say anything. And you may have gone through what they're going through, but you still don't know how they feel, because you're a totally different person. You got a totally different makeup, and it just recently a preacher um, had to preach his sister's funeral, and after it was over, after he finished, um, I just knew, I knew that it was gonna all come right then, because you're trying to deliver and come through for your family member, your loved one. But once it's done, and so when he disappeared in the back, I knew. And so I just went back um, to where he was, and wasn't no need to say that. I just knew it. He knew I knew. But
Mhm.
I didn't know exactly how he felt, because that was his sister. He was raised with his sister that was totally different from my sister. But I just know he needed somebody to hug him. And yeah, we call that just the ministry of silence, and just let your presence do the speaking for you.
Good, very good. Anyone else? Any other questions, comments? Ministry of silence. All right. So grief and mental health. So as we've been talking about, the things I've kind of mentioned throughout the talk is like, hey, if grief becomes overwhelming, it can develop into clinical conditions. And what we mean by clinical conditions is depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, suicidal behaviors. There's a lot of ways in which grief can become a full-on diagnosable thing that can require some professional help, some some hands being laid, some prayers being prayed. It can be a thing. And so we want to monitor that for ourselves as much as possible, but we also want to be that for other people if we can see that, hey, what they have going on, or where they're managing things, where they're moving forward. It seems that it's becoming overwhelming, and it's not they can't really get past it. We may need to step in and just have conversation with them, and maybe provide resources for them. And if grief is prolonged, if it impairs your daily functioning, or if they're, again, like I said, if the thoughts of self harm, we definitely need to intervene for that person or for ourselves. If we don't have anybody else that's looking out for us, we have to be diligent to understand, like, hey, this is becoming too much time. Get some help. And then the next, and I just wanted to have these scriptures here, just because grief is a thing, and we kind of talked about it before. Um, there is sometimes we don't understand, sometimes we don't get the answer, sometimes we don't know why a thing has happened. But as I was saying before, the end, and maybe not the end all be all, but moving towards the end or understanding, um, we get to that cycle of acceptance. There has to be something for us, especially as believers in the teachings of Jesus Christ. Where do we lean on, and where do we go to help us better process and to work through? And I think some of these scriptures that I've kind of listed here, um, can be helpful, for us to meditate on, and then for if the time is right for us to share with others. Um, and again, if the ministry is the ministry of silence, hey, maybe just pass them on. Say, I'd like to share these with you and keep it pushing. Sometimes they might lead to dialogue that you can have with that person, that's going through. But I think the main point of a lot of these scriptures is like God is here. He's able to comfort us. He's able to bring joy in the morning. He understands that there's weeping. He understands there's sadness. He understands there's pain. Jesus himself felt these things. And so we have a loving God who can walk with us through these times, even if we don't have answers, even if we don't know why, even if we can't say, hey, this is exactly why this thing's happened, and we know why this thing happened. We do have a God that we can lean on and trust in, that can help us through those times, if we so choose to lean into that help. That's pretty much it. And final thoughts is, grief is a personal journey. There's no right or wrong way. In general, we can grieve wrongly, but there's no right or wrong way. Healing takes time, and support systems are key. You got to have those support systems, and we have to have people in place either to provide the support or people that we can lean on when we need support. And oftentimes, um, again, if the ministry is the ministry of silence, let's operate in the mode thereof. Any other final questions or comments or thoughts?
I just think it was a real good discussion, and I think this was a real good discussion.
I agree. I enjoyed it.
All right, all right. Want to thank everybody for joining us. Please be sure to share this post. I'm sure that others will be able to benefit. We all go through events in our lives that have the potential to cause grief, and it's good to be equipped with the tools and the skill set on learning how to manage that grief so that we can hopefully make it out on the other side, in a better place, understanding that we still have purpose. So I want to thank soon to be Dr. John Parker, for being prepared, and thank all of you for joining us. Real Talk Bible Study is actually in person tomorrow, so come on out. We have a good discussion that's set up that Brother Nick Causey put out there, and we'll have good dinner as usual, 6 o'clock here at the church. God bless you. Have a great one.
Oh, and
Good
Pastor,
night.
there's a question. How do we share this with others? And can the PowerPoint be sent? The Pastor Ross has the email with the PowerPoint in it. I don't know. Is there a way that people can get it, or I can put it in the chat here? Or
Yeah. So, okay. So one way is just share the post, but another way, if you just want just straight PowerPoint and John gives permission, just email the church, gbgvilleoutlook.com, and I'll reply to your email with the PowerPoint if that's okay with John.
yeah, sure.
All right. Perfect. God bless you all, and you have a great
Good night. Don't forget to watch the
Good night,
debate tonight.
everyone.
one. All right.